Hey friends, welcome back to another video. I'm just working on a few drawings for my beach residence project, for which we're going to kick off construction in the next few weeks, and I thought I'd give you a little bit of insight on my design process and how I develop my ideas into a floor plan. So to give you a little bit of context, the task for the project at our hands is to build 8 vacation rental units on one of the most remote beaches in Costa Rica. This is obviously quite a nice job because we probably need to move there, including all of my office, and I will document every step on the way, so make sure you subscribe if you want to follow along. So the first thing we have to do for any project is to figure out all liabilities and opportunities of the site. We want to find out things like relevant trees, access, roads, neighbors, sun and wind direction, location of cables and pipes, or anything else you can think of that could seem to be relevant for the project. I also think it's helpful to visit the site over multiple days during different times of the day. We want to understand what's happening on and around the property in terms of noise, light, or any unexpectancies that occur only during certain times. The reason why I'm telling you that is that in our case we had quite the epiphany when we found out that a monkey family is having everyday breakfast on one of our mango trees. That mango tree is now under protection, no one can touch it. However, we will need to integrate it in our design. Next thing we want to look at is zoning and code requirements. So things that are defined by government like minimum setbacks, maximum heights, certain other restrictions, for example, types of roofing or property walls or fences that we might be required to build. And finally, we need to figure out the details about program and budget. We need a list of spaces, their rough sizes and other requirements from the client. We want to make sure that the square meter amount corresponds to the budget, because we don't want to design and plan something that the owner cannot afford. For that, we usually can do a rough estimate by multiplying the square meter by the average building cost of the area. So for example, in Costa Rica, that might be anywhere between $750 to $1,200. And if we compare that, for example, to Austria, where we have 3 to 4K, you can see that the building costs can vary quite a bit. So it's smart to do that right at the beginning to see if the program specs are in the realm of possibilities. And since this project is an investment for the owner, we also started a market research on vacation rental. So we tried to understand things like which kind of properties are out there, what's the price value ratio, or how much time are they rented within a year. We also did a research on amenities that are must-haves to qualify for a certain price category, and not to forget about things we need to integrate in our design in order to differentiate. So that could be things like, for example, to have a pool or a dedicated bathroom per bedroom. So before we could even think about drawing floor plans, we were scouting for properties to finally find this one. We did feasibility studies and we worked even on the business plan to make sure that the investment yields the appropriate return. Let's move from money to design. Before I draw my first line, I like to surround myself with things that massage and stimulate my brain to generate ideas. And according to the saying, garbage in, garbage out, I always try to find myself content that kind of sparks my imagination instead of killing it, which I consider to be done with low quality experiences such as TV or social media. So instead, I like to look at interesting books. Sometimes it means to travel. It could be something you see on the street, material samples, or simply things from the web like cool graphics and branding ideas. But where I draw inspiration from really depends on the project that I'm currently working on. For this project, I put together a mood board, and you can clearly see that there's a certain tendency towards the use of timber, the color black, extremely wide interiors, and little terrace gardens. The idea behind it is that we essentially on one hand create architecture that picks up traditional building elements that are used and widely available here in Costa Rica, but on the other hand also try to introduce modern elements that are creating contrast to what's usually being built and basically draw the best out of both worlds. So something that I like to think about early in the design process is how can I create identity for the building? So something that kind of makes it recognizable and gives it a unique character. Every great piece of architecture in the world has a leading motive behind the project, and I actually think the biggest danger in the project is in any project is that the motive is lost on the way. Projects naturally like to dilute into different directions that might cloud their overall idea. That's just how it goes. So there are really always these things we identify as opportunities and we want to implement until we have done 10 different design elements competing with each other. So a mantra that I'm trying to follow is the less is more approach. So the stronger I focus on one idea, on one thing, the better and the more interesting the final design will be. So I think the easiest step to get into the process of developing the geometry is actually starting out abstract, as abstract as possible. And that can be actually done with a diagram. diagram doesn't need to be in scale or worry about the details, so it takes out the complexity from the process and allows us to break down the project and look at all the factors individually. It's a great way to rule out the really bad ideas from the actual good ideas. It also helps to find and map out our larger motive for the project. For example, the general program distribution, like where the private and public spaces are located, or how we want to interact with the environment, like ground, neighbors, sun orientation, or simply formal design elements. This is a stage in which we can test and experiment. Just to be clear, we don't have to worry about specific dimensions and measurements. Widths of doors and windows will come later. For now, we just try to initiate the design process by understanding all the information we gathered so far and build upon them with ideas and maybe even some first design decisions. For our beach residence project, one of the questions we have to answer is how we treat our project in terms of aesthetics, as the project is spanning over 2 properties with different owners. So that means in fact 2 buildings, and there are essentially 2 ways we can handle that situation. We can either design 2 individual projects that formally don't have anything in common, or we try to come up with something that unifies them so they look alike. For me, often these diagrams start to become sketches about the actual building, which is already a big leap from an empty sheet to actually something very concrete and building-like. I think that the secret in any good design lies in the way its elements are organized and positioned in relation to each other. So because our building is going to have up to 3 levels, one thing we want to make sure is that our load-bearing walls are all located on top of each other. All those spaces might be differently positioned and arranged on each level. We want to make sure that things end up with a certain order, and because we are starting with an empty sheet, we need to create order out of nothing. So what we want to do is we want to get a pen, some paper, and create a grid that acts as a guide. Especially for smaller projects, I think a grid is the best approach to keep things organized and sensible. By the way, paper and pen is not necessary, you can do all of that also on your computer. The grid can be squared, rectangular, triangular, or even curved, and aligned based on different side parameters. Then the grid becomes more flexible and maybe reminds more on some sort of force field. For this project, however, I think a simple grid in increments of 60 makes most sense, so either 60, 120, 180 or 240, as these sizes also relate to the actual building material dimensions. For example, a kitchen drawer or a wardrobe usually has a depth of 60, a queen-size bed has a width of 180, or a mid-sized dining table has around 90 by 180 centimeters. You get the idea. Using a grid doesn't mean we need to design the whole floor plan in it, but there will be moments where we will need or want to break out to adjust it to our needs, whether that's changing the increments or even the direction. So when drawing, we want to start with a rough idea, start breaking it down and refine and repeat that cycle multiple times. First use mostly thick line markers, then start with finer pens and later add some color to it to finish it up. We can also take the sketch and clean it up by blocking it out in CAD or even experiment in 3D so we can print it again and keep sketching over it. We do this until we end up with something that starts to look like a floor plan. I usually like to start by placing elements that are most rigid in their dimensions, like staircases for example, but it also can help to simply draw out a bedroom or living room layout, which gives a sense of scale and available space that we are dealing with. From there, it's a continuously adding and subtracting, shifting, moving and scaling, and a forth and back between getting an idea onto paper, refining it, digitalizing it, printing it and drawing over it again. That can often take quite a lot of time until I achieve something that I think makes sense and is aesthetically on a level where it's compelling and shows me some character. But what often helps me to achieve progress is to let it sit overnight and come back the next day with a fresh perspective. Looking at our beach residence project once more, we can see that we have chosen to go with a unified design approach where the 2 buildings are right beside each other with the same organization and design features. Having a long volume makes the building look more dynamic, and I think that it has the benefit that it shows more presence. However, something we need to take care of is that the building doesn't look out of scale due to its length. So what we did, and that's something we were only able to figure out by experimenting in 3D and consider the sectional qualities, we started to move the building back, taking away from the precious backside, which is oriented towards the sea, and add a facade with differently spaced out columns that make it look more organic. So this is quite a big building, so there are a lot of questions and thoughts and ideas that went into this project, so which would probably exceed the format of this video. If you want to see more of this project, about the design process or anything else that comes to your mind in regards, let me know in the comments. I'm happy to build future videos based on this project. And if that was just remotely interesting, hit like and subscribe. And in that sense, we see us next week. Have a nice one until then.